And if you could tell us how you related to Samuel Baker as you're introducing yourself, that would help.
I'm Mary now, and I'm the granddaughter of Samuel and Elizabeth. My husband Hank, my daughter Linda, and my son Scott. And they would be great grandchildren.
I'm Sam Houston. My great-grandfather, my great-grandfather was John Pender, who was the brother of Elizabeth Pender Baker, right? So somehow or another we're cousins. Those are my grandparents.
Oh, wow.
And my father and his sister, yeah.
And where's supposedly this picture taken?
Looks like
Supposedly, I've been told it was at the Pender house, but don't know.
I've got a few thanks that I would like to say before we get started. And the very first thanks I would like to shout out to is to the inventors and manufacturers of metal roofs and those that were wise enough to apply them to the structure. I'm going to pass this around, and this is most likely the reason why we are able to be here tonight, is that somebody had the forethought to put the metal roof on the Baker house so that it would sustain these many years, and for that we've got to thank them. I want to send out a special thanks to Laurie Baker for her kind and generous help and guidance, and not only for her previous work in the restoration project and all of the Baker functions that have gone through the years, but for her continued work and the work that she'll do in the future. And without her, I don't think that an awful lot of this research would have been discovered or found or even, well. And to the entire Baker family and the extended family, thank you very much for coming tonight. And thank you for all of your kind and generous donations through the years and help during the research period. And I'd also like to thank all of the people that were involved in the restoration project that started in the early 90s and proceeded on through to what we have now today is known as the Baker House Museum. That list would probably, we'd want to mention the questers, the quilters, all of the people of the historical societies and historical groups, and last but not least, our local government, our county government, our state government, and our federal government for giving us the funds so that we would be able to do what's been accomplished up to this point. Without the involvement of all these peoples and groups, we wouldn't have this history preserved for the future generations, and we'd have to do something else every third Saturday morning of the month. My basic hope tonight with this presentation, and the reason that I primarily started this work, is so that we could possibly garner some interest from new members that have come to the club and future members and existing members to kind of get more interested in learning about the Baker history and assisting and giving tours. And to that end, if anybody feels the urge to start participating and wanting to learn the history of the Baker family and all of the other things that are going along with the Baker House Museum, I'll be more than happy to assist in possibly a reading list and materials that would help you facilitate that knowledge. And I'd like to thank Jeff Miller, who's doing the taping tonight, and will probably be able to see this presentation, an edited version, on YouTube. And I think we'll be able to link to it if we go to the Western Pasco Historical Society. And you'll see a link to YouTube, and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. There's also well, not quite a few, but 3 or 4 different little snippets of YouTube presentations of previous Baker House presentations, primarily the tours that Gordon Baker gave through the years. I've seen 2 or 3 of them, and I think there's a couple of others that have made it to YouTube, maybe Facebook, I'm not sure. And I'd also, at this point, like to introduce and thank Jeff Cannon, who's a local historian and author. And with that, I've got to do a little plugging for Jeff. These are some of his works. And with Christmas not too far in the future, that historian in the family, this would make a wonderful gift. And he's also got another publication coming out, and I'm sure he'll tell us about that. And I'd also like to thank David and Tora for supplying the projector and the Master Gardeners group that I believe that's who belongs to. And I want to apologize to David for stepping on his newly planted seeds yesterday.
They came up.
Oh, it was the magic touch, huh? And I think that's, without further ado, let's start the presentation. Jeff Cannon.
My name is Jeff Cannon. I'm a 5th generation resident from Pasco County. My family settled excuse me, in the Hudson area in the late 1870s, and we have been there since. I do have family ties and connections into the Brooksville area that date back to the early 1840s. So my family has been in the immediate area for quite some time. My involvement with local history, because of my family ties and my family connections, I tend to have a little more of a keen interest in our local history. I currently serve with the East Elfers Cemetery Committee, and I also, I'm the vice chairman there. I'm also the president at the West Elfers Cemetery Preservation Association, which is the organization that's involved at West Elfers. I am also the vice president of the Hudson Cemetery Preservation Association. I also work as a director of a nonprofit organization that I established here in Pasco County that does cemetery preservation work called the Pasco County Historical Preservation Society. I'm also on the board of directors of the Hudson Rotary Club and am a lifetime member of the West Pasco Historical Society and the Pioneer Florida Museum. Typically what I do with my research is I write. I'm a writer. I also work as a freelance contributor for the Newport Richey Patch and Land O'Lakes Patch. For those of you that are not familiar with that, that is a community online newspaper, and I do have a weekly historical column that I write for them. In addition to the Hudson book that I had come out in 2009, I also have a book that will be released on November 7th, 2011 called Then and Now Newport Richey, which is kind of a retrospective look at how Newport Richey was compared to what it looks like today. But moving on to the Baker House. Don contacted me, I guess it was towards the beginning of summer, and he had a few questions and inquiries about the Baker House history, and he asked me if I could possibly answer a few questions. I didn't necessarily have the answers at that point in time, but I told Don that I'd be willing to expend the time and look through the research and through the resources that we have here in Pasco County and of course in Hernando County to see if we couldn't piece together some of the history of the Baker House. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and get started. How many people here are familiar with Samuel Baker and who he was? Are there very many other than maybe the family members? Well, the main objective of the research was to determine when Samuel Baker arrived to the area. Some of the previously written histories stated it was sometime around 1880, and we believe that may have been based upon some of the land records and acquisition of the land where the Baker House now resides. Another one was to determine when the Bakers became involved with the Bailey's Bluff operation, in the sponging operation. How many are familiar with Bailey's Bluff and where that's located? Okay, so most of you know. To give you a little bit of background about Samuel Baker, he was born in Key West in about 1843. He was from a Bahamian lineage. His family migrated here from the Bahamas, settled in Key West. This is a copy of the 1860 census for Key West. And we see the family of John and Sarah Ann Baker. And on page 2, we see Samuel Baker, age 17. Even at the age of 17, Samuel was employed as a mariner at that point in time. He worked upon either a sailing vessel or perhaps a steam vessel, and in the course of his work, he aided in the navigation of that vessel. Typically, these were merchant-type vessels, whether it was moving cattle or whether it was moving corn or whatever it was typically a merchant-type situation. To bring it up to Pasco County, when Samuel Baker was living down in Key West, we had a pioneer settler here in Pasco County by the name of Peter Carr Bailey. Peter Carr Bailey purchased the Bailey's Bluff property in 1867 from the state of Florida. As the family's history tells us, at that point in time he built a small house out there and also constructed a trading business where he was trading with the local fishermen. Some accounts attribute the sponging operations off the coast of Florida as beginning as early as 1852, but by the time the Civil War had come around, that industry had been significantly inhibited because of the activities off of our coast during the Civil War, with the East Gulf Blockade Squadron, which were Union boats that basically patrolled the Gulf and were stopping the Confederates from shipping supplies out of Florida. We see in 1869, Peter Carr Bailey paid taxes on Bailey's Bluff. Now, there are no legal descriptions on this property, and I do have a pointer here. But in later records, we see that Bailey's Bluff was about 22 acres in size. While this does not show what property he was paying taxes on, we see he was paying taxes on 22 acres, which is about the size of Bailey's Bluff property. We know he didn't own any other property at that point in time. There are no other land records that show him owning any other property, so we assume that this 1869 record, since he acquired the Bluff property 2 years prior, is the record for Bailey's Bluff. We see it had a taxable value of $300 at that point in time, which was pretty significant for that time period. That would seem to also indicate that there were improvements there, just as the family histories tell us. In 1872, or I should state sometime between 1870 and 1872, and the reason I say that is because we do not have the tax records prior, or for the years 1870 and 1871. So if we look at the tax records for the year 1872, we find that the property known as Bailey's Bluff, which is fractional section 22 of Township 26, range 15, had been sold to a Eugenia Stevens. We're not quite sure who Eugenia Stevens is or how she fits into the picture, but at this point in time when she acquired the property, she was living in Cedar Keys. So there's a very good possibility that her family had visited the Bluff area prior to them buying it. There had to be some reason why somebody in Cedar Keys bought a piece of property here in Pasco County. She would basically hold this property until the time of her death in 1886, and we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go through the history. While this transaction's going on, Samuel Baker is still living in Key West. He has not yet arrived to Pasco County. We see him here in the 1870 census, age 27, with the title of seaman. And again, that does not necessarily mean he was in charge of a boat, it simply meant he worked aboard a boat and assisted in the navigation of that vessel. Later on in history, we see that he did work his way through the ranks and did achieve the position of a captain. So at some point in time, he had been through the trade and had learned and worked his way up to basically navigate or be in charge of a vessel himself. The first records that we see Samuel Baker in the local area is in 1876. Now, this is a record that, and Don can maybe verify this, that we have not seen in any of the history for the Baker house yet. We see in 1876 Samuel Baker paying taxes here. He also was acting as the agent for Henry Baker, which was his brother. Let me back up real quick. I basically wanted to read through basically what he paid taxes on in 1876. Samuel Baker, as agent for Henry Baker, is shown in tax records. There's no property recorded. Taxes were paid on 2 horses and 2 stock or meat cattle. Full value of the animals was $106, and Samuel is also shown with personal property valued at $15. In addition, he paid the personal property taxes for his brother Henry, and he had a property valued at $25 at that point in time. So again, this is the earliest record we find of Samuel Baker here in the local area, and each record thereafter he appears. So it's safe to assume that Samuel Baker arrived to Pasco County, arrived to our area in 1876, based on tax records. In 1880, after he arrived to the area, we don't know between 1876 and 1880 where he lived. There's a possibility he lived out on the bluff, as the family history says. There's also a possibility that he may have began construction of his house that's now known as the Baker House. A lot of our early records in tracing the families of West Pasco, a lot of these settlers came down to this area and they squatted on the land for several years before they purchased it from the state of Florida. This was the case in Hudson with the Hudson family. They arrived in that area in 1878 and did not purchase the property that they lived on from the state of Florida until 1882. So there's a very good possibility that when Samuel arrived, he began construction on his house and later purchased the land from the state of Florida. But there's also the possibility he lived at the bluff at that point in time. In 1880, he did buy the property known as where the Baker House resides from the state of Florida. He paid $1 per acre for 40 acres. So he paid $40 for the 40 acres where his house is built. To give you a perspective of where his property was, this is the Baker House right here. In platting out the legal description for his land, that is the 40 acres that Samuel purchased from the state of Florida. As you can see, most of it's covered with modern homes now. We know that by 1882, based on tax records, that Samuel had cleared 10 acres of his 40, and he had cultivated 8 of that. In 1885, the state census, they included what was called an agricultural schedule. Based on this record, we see Samuel Baker in 1885. He's on line number 4. He had 10 acres cleared, 30 acres that was still wooded. And if you look over here on this column at the far right, he owned 1 horse at that point in time. And following again line 4, we see Samuel Baker had 8 acres planted in Indian corn. And then he had a half an acre that was planted in potatoes. sweet potatoes. That gives you 8.5 acres. The remaining property, or the remaining 1.5 acres, was pasture land that was used for livestock. In 1888, Samuel Baker is joined by his wife Elizabeth Baker in deeding a 1-acre tract from their 40 acres to the school board. This was the location of where the Bailey Schoolhouse had been built. It was built on the corner of their property on land that the school board did not yet own. Between 1887 and 1897, Samuel Baker also served as the trustee for this schoolhouse. And again, platting the legal description for his property, we see that the 1-acre schoolhouse basically sat in the northeast corner of their 40 acres, which is on the corner of Moog Road and Madison. And that is an approximate size of the property, but again, based on the deed, that's where the schoolhouse was located. This school was a predecessor of the Elfers Schoolhouse, which I don't know if many of you are familiar with. It's in downtown Elfers. It's the 1914 red brick schoolhouse where the Care Senior Center is now located. But this was an earlier or predecessor school to the Elfers Schoolhouse. In 1883, and I know I'm taking a little step back here, but in 1883, Samuel also acquired another piece of property. This was another 40-acre tract, and again, it was purchased from the state of Florida, this time through the Internal Improvement Fund. And that was basically a fund that the state ran that allowed the sale of lands at auction or at public sale to basically promote internal improvements within the state, to promote people to improve and build things or build businesses or even towns. Again, Samuel paid $1 an acre for 40 acres. He paid $40 for this 40 acres. This property was situated on Trouble Creek. And again, platting this out, for those of you that are not familiar, this is Trouble Creek. It runs into Bailey's Bluff Road and runs down towards Bailey's Bluff. But this 40-acre tract, again, sat on Trouble Creek. This is Trouble Creek as it empties out into the Gulf, and you can see it flows up in here, basically right into Samuel's property. Now what's interesting to note is a lot of the previous research and history indicates that around 1883, Samuel Baker started or engaged in the sponging operations that were at Bailey's Bluff. This is about, to give you a perspective, this is about a mile north of Bailey's Bluff. In 1883, when Samuel acquired this piece, Bailey's Bluff was still owned by Eugenia Stevens. So then the question is, in 1883, did Samuel start his sponging operation at Bailey's Bluff, or was it started at the Trouble Creek property? And again, this is a record that shows in 1883, the same point in time that he acquired that, Eugenia Nason, she remarried at this point in time to a Prescott Nason, but she was paying the taxes on fractional quarter 222615, which is Bailey's Bluff. At that point in time, the property was valued at $110. So again, the question is, did the Bakers use their Trouble Creek property for sponging? That is the question that we have not yet determined. And talking with Don back and forth about this, one way we may be able to determine that is to look at the value, the taxable value of those properties in the tax records again, to determine if the value on that property increased. Obviously, if it increased and there was a taxable value on improvements, then it's safe to assume there was some type of operation there, some type of improvements. So again, The question was, when did Samuel Baker arrive? Through records, it appears he arrived to Pasco County in 1876. He acquired the property where the Baker house is at in 1880, and then by 1883 he had acquired another 40 acres that was on Trouble Creek. So how does Bailey's Bluff play into all of this? When did they acquire Bailey's Bluff? That is still an answer or a question that remains unanswered. Again, in 1886, Eugenia Stevens Nason passes away. In her last will and testament, she leaves the 22 acres that is known as Bailey's Bluff to her 3 children, Swepston Stevens, Ida Floyd, and Eugenia Stevens. And she appointed her son-in-law, Charles Floyd, as the administrator of the estate. After 1886, after she dies, we see in tax records the Bailey's Bluff property, the taxes that are paid by Charles Floyd. Charles Floyd was a boat captain who lived in Jacksonville. We don't know that he ever came here to Pasco County. That's still a little unclear, or whether or not he had somebody that ran the operation for them. So we're still looking into some of that part of the history. In 1897, Captain Charles Floyd sold the Bailey's Bluff property to Samuel Baker. We see here what is called a bond for title for $300 down and another $300 to be paid on or before the 1st of November 1897. Samuel Baker received title to the 22 acres known as Bailey's Bluff. And again, this is in 1897. From that point in time, the operations at Bailey's Bluff significantly change. It was in about the same time period that John Chaney, for any of you that are familiar with Tarpon Springs history, John Chaney started a company by the name of the Anclote and Rock Island Sponge Company. And what Chaney's purpose, or what his company's purpose was to basically change the sponging industry as we knew it. He felt that there had been deception in the industry when it came to weighing and packaging sponges, and he was going to come in here and he was going to change that industry. He basically, just south of the Anclote River on a little point of land known as Point Alexis, I don't know if many of you are familiar with that, that's where his sponging operations were located. It was called Sponge Harbor at that point in time. And Chaney basically put advertisements out in newspapers, or advertisements that were put in foreign newspapers in Greece. And that's how the beginning of the Greek sponge divers in this area started. He had employed a young man in his sponging operation early on that basically told him the Greek divers in Greece were harvesting about 4 times as many of the sponges as the Key West conch crews, as they were known, that were using the old pole and hook method. Basically, they had a set of hooks, or a 3-pronged grappling hook that was on the end of a pole, and they looked through the water through what was referred to as a glass bottom bucket, and they would basically hook the sponges from the bottom of the Gulf floor. Chaney's operation and the bringing of the Greek divers here significantly changed things. There was a shift in the sponging operation after Chaney's company got started, and again, that shift was south, away from Bailey's Bluff. And I believe, and again, this is a personal belief, to entice the sponge fishermen to basically stay at Bailey's Bluff. By 1900, we see the Bakers, in conjunction with a woman by the name of Emma Sterling, establishing what is called the Pavilion Church and Reading Room on Bailey's Bluff. This was a pavilion, and they packed it and stocked it with literature that was donated. And basically, when it wasn't used for religious purposes on Sunday, it was used as a reading room for the sponge fishermen. It gave them something to do, gave them a place to go to church, You know, when these crews were on land and not out in the waters doing their business, collecting and harvesting sponges, they didn't have anything to do. Basically sat around. So the Bakers deed an 80 by 100 foot lot with a 15-foot wide strip to access the Gulf to the Pavilion Church and Reading Room. At the same point in time as they're constructing the church, Samuel B. Baker, who is the elder Samuel Baker's son, is making an application to the Postmaster General to establish a post office on Bailey's Bluff. If you look here at the application, it was originally applied for under the name Baker, but it was approved under the name Security. And I've been asked, well, why Security? You know, the spongers brought their sponges after they harvested them to Bailey's Bluff, and they kept them in what were called crawls. These were basically small pin enclosures that were in, you know, knee-deep water, and the sponges were stored there. And basically what the Bakers did is they were watchmen over these sponge crawls. And the spongers bringing those to the Bailey's crawls basically was security for those spongers. It was security for their harvest. So that may be a reason why they called it security. I'm not sure. But one note I do want to make on here is they referred to it as a new village just starting, and they say that a church is being built. That's referencing the Pavilion Church and Reading Room, which was being constructed at that point in time. And that's a close-up. The Bakers basically retained ownership of the Bailey's Bluff property all the way up until about 1912. And then there was a transfer, and I don't want to get into the whole issues as to why the property was sold and why it was transferred, but they essentially sold the property to a young man by the name of Joseph Blackburn, who was a sponge house worker down in Tarpon Springs. For $900, they sold him the 22 acres known as Bailey's Bluff. And to give you a perspective, this is a 1941 aerial of Bailey's Bluff before there was development there. This is basically Trouble Creek Road as it goes out onto the bluff. You can see that there is significant white sand beaches that's all along here. We believe that the majority of the operations occurred on the north section of the bluff. Essentially, the bluff property, as they owned it, ended right in this general area and was from here over. That was the 22 acres known as Bailey's Bluff. Give you a perspective of what it looks like today. This is the natural inlet into this harbor. This has been dredged. This has all been dredged. I'm sure this has been dredged as well, but this canal has been dredged around here. And it's covered with houses, obviously. And I did want to kind of give you a step back in time and to show you where the roads in respect today, where they would have been if they were there in 1941. And of course, without the roads again. We researched through records basically from about 1867 as it relates to land records and tax records, from 1867 all the way up until 1912 when the Bakers relinquished their interest in that Bailey's Bluff property. Of course, Samuel Baker died about a year after he acquired the Bluff property, and it seems that the majority of the operations, unless there was a prior lease that we're not aware of, but it seems like the majority of those operations were carried out by his family, by his sons So, I mean, he didn't live long enough to really see their Bailey's Bluff interest take off. In addition to the post office and church, they also operated a small store on the bluff. There are some records that relate to the store, lists of boats that visited the area, dates for transactions, things of that nature. So we do have some scant semblance of records from their store that they operated there too. Again, does anybody have any questions?
Do you know where on the bluff the store was located?
Well, again,
Church and...
we're not exactly sure. Based on the description in the church deed, we know that the church was located on the northern end of the bluff. We suspect, although we're not, certain, that the post office and store would have probably been in that general area. The idea of the post office being established was so that the sponge fishermen could send mail out from that area. Otherwise, they had to basically venture south to Anclote or Tarpon Springs to mail a letter. So we believe the majority of that stuff was on the north end of the bluff. Any other questions? Again, I know I covered a lot of stuff and went through a long time period there.
The amount of people who were actually visiting the bluff, the amount of spongers from those early years and how it progressed up to the point of where there was an actual need for a church and a post office. And
Yeah, again, the sponging operation along the coast began as early as 1852, perhaps a little earlier. That was inhibited by the Civil War. After the Civil War, there were significant fleets that came up from the Keys. And when I say fleets, these were boats that were 15 to 20 tons in size. These were large sailing vessels. They basically, some of these accounts attribute thousands of these boats off of our coast at any given time during the peak of the season. There are a couple pictures that do show the Gulf horizon just lined with sails and sponging boats. So, I mean, this was a significant operation. This is where the Tarpon Springs sponging industry began, was on our side of the river. So, a lot of people don't realize that, and when you go downtown Tarpon and you start looking through the history down there, you won't hear about it either. By 1905, there were some 500 Greek divers that had come to this area to basically be employed in the sponging industry. So in addition to the Key West crews that were here, we had John Chaney and, like I said, by 1905, another 500 Greek divers. And when those divers arrived, that created a significant rivalry between the Key West crews and the Greek divers. There are some accounts of actual boats being set on fire and burned over this relationship between these two. So, there is some very rich history there as it relates to the sponging industry.
this here, I'm sure those of us who are familiar with the Baker House have seen this book at the Baker House. Well, that isn't the actual book that I'm going to be referring to, but Laurie Baker has in her possession a book very similar to that, and that's a ledger book from the store at the Baker House. And here are the list of customers that are in that ledger book that came from that store, and there's probably 103 different schooners and sloops that the crews of those schooners and sloops would come ashore when they're putting their harvest into the crawls and then going into the store for their provisions and their personal provisions. This is their customer list from the year 1900. and I believe 1901, one of those 2 years. Obviously, there was a ledger book for each year of operation. This was saved. This ledger book was saved out in, I believe, close to Dade City from Toby. Was it Toby who saved it? It was Otis who saved it from
And Toby got the book.
from Toby's children, who were ripping pages out of it to draw with their crayons on. This list is absolutely fascinating. One boat that's on this list has got a absolutely fascinating history to it. It's the Rapid. And first of all, before I describe what the Rapid story is, have any of you ever been to Key West, Florida? Have any of you ever taken the tour on the trolley train at Key West, Florida? Well, if you've taken that trolley train, you have ridden past the house that is described as the gingerbread house. That gingerbread house was constructed in Key West by Benjamin Baker, who is a cousin to our Samuel Baker, a distant cousin, and his bloodline shows up in the DNA Bahamian project and matches some of Samuel's DNA, and so we have it. Back to the Rapid. Benjamin Baker was known as the king of the wreckers, and he was I can't remember the exact amount of wrecks that he was I can't remember what the term is, but there was a term for the first captain on site of a wreck who would ask the captain of the wrecked ship if they wanted assistance. If the captain of the wrecked ship accepted, that man who offered the assistance would become the captain of that salvage operation, of which, when it went to courts, the federal courts in Key West, a large portion of that salvage material would be awarded to the captain who offered the assistance to the salvaged items. So, basically speaking, Benjamin Baker was on, I believe, over 40 different wrecks, and he was by far one of the greatest, had the greatest number of salvages in the area. He built the gingerbread house, plus he had property on Key Largo, in the Key Largo area, where he had a plantation where he planted pineapples, was one of his, and he had, I believe, 7 other schooners than the Rapid, and he would use those schooners to take the pineapples to market.
Can you go back to the relationship between Samuel Baker and his family and the people sitting here, like who got married and who had children, just so we can understand that as well?
We can, suffice it to say, these are his grandchildren's children, if that might help.
The other granddaughter. Are they? Are there any other siblings that are still alive, or is it a smaller family now?
No, they're lost.
Oh, are there a lot of Bakers still? Oh, that's
It's amazing how.
Michelle, we've got a little printout that Laurie sent along when I first contacted her. It gives a pretty nice background of Samuel Baker and Elizabeth Pinder
Oh,
Baker.
I'd like to read that.
Yeah, very interesting, and it shows all of the background. It doesn't come forward as much as I would have liked it to, but maybe someday we'll get Laurie to update it a little bit.
Yes. Yes.
That's what I was curious. Oh, five sons.
And if any of you are interested, the Bakers are buried out at East Elfers Cemetery. That's where Samuel Baker's buried. That's where his son is buried. That's where large portion of the family is buried. So you can go in there. The gates are open. You can.
What is it?
East Elfers Cemetery is over off Rowan Road. And it's near. Is it? Well, I thought that was Old Bailey Road, or Bailey Road is what it was.
Yeah, because you can go down Cecilia, and then it jags off into Rowan.
If you're coming from 19, you come up Cecilia, it turns into Bailey Road, and basically on the big curve in Bailey Road is where the cemetery is located. If you hit the stop sign at Rowan Road, you've gone too far. It's right next to, there's I don't know if it's a Baptist church or what, but there's a fairly large church that's right next door. It's not too far from the Marine Corps that's on the corner of Bailey Road and Rowan Road.
Were there 11 children in that home? Or how many actually lived in the home?
There were 5 that survived. I know they had more children than that, but there were 5 that none of the survivors were girls. They were all boys. So at some point in time, there may have been, more than just those 5 and the mother and father living there. I've actually found some records where in 1885 there, and I don't know how they relate to the Baker family, but there were 2 Baker children that died only months apart. Obviously some type of sickness that they acquired, but they were very young, 1 and 3 years old, I believe. One was named Arthur, and I can't remember the other one's name, but we do have, some records, and unfortunately, given their ages of 1 and 3 in 1885, they don't show up in the 1880 census. So we can't really place them with the family in any of the census records, other than the fact that we know there were 2 Baker children that died here in 1885. So, again, there could have been more than just those 5 children living in the household.
And what year did the family move out?
Well, that's interesting. In 1906, the 40 acres where the Baker house sits was sold at public auction. It was a result of a court order, and I don't want to get into all of what that had to do with, but it had to do with rendering care for a minor child that was an orphan. Basically, it was sold at auction for $45, and J.T. Baker, John T. Baker, purchased that, and it remained in the family, I believe, until about 1916. And then it was purchased, I believe, by a Philadelphia banker, and then it transferred to the Anderson family. But from Elizabeth and Samuel's possession, it was in 1906, and then that's when the son bought it from at public auction, basically. And that was sold by the county commissioners in 1906.
I think Goebel, the publisher of the Ladies' Home Journal from Philadelphia, is the person who ultimately bought the property initially, and he bought it for the express purpose of buying other plots to put in as orange groves.
Yeah, and there are some records, and there were some other properties that are in that immediate area that John T. Baker was involved with. I found some mention of it in the deeds the other day. He basically owned like a third of an interest in another piece of property that was in that immediate area, and I believe that may have been the beginning of the orange grove in that area. He was partnered, I believe, with Lewis Gaines, who was another pioneer family from this area.